Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Canon EOS R50. This is their compact mirrorless body that was their cheapest body until the more recently released R100 model. Now, I want to start by saying a big thank you to Camera Canada for getting me a loaner of this camera and also the kit lens that comes with it. I have had a difficult time getting Canon loaners in recent years, and they've been great to help me out however and whenever they can. So thanks to Camera Canada, they've become the source that I personally go to for buying basically all of my gear at this point, and so thanks to them. My first foray into Canon mirrorless was actually with the original Canon EOS M, which was their first mirrorless camera. The EOS M lineup has died after about 10 years of existence, though part of the reason for that is that Canon gave it next to no support for the latter half of its existence. After 10 years, there was a grand total of 8 lenses that existed from Canon in the EF-M mount. So Canon has obviously dumped that after not really having supported it, and they are all in on their RF mount, including the APS-C version, which they call RFS. The R50 is an APS-C specific camera, and it's part of the newer, basically a newer version of the M50 Mark II, but in a body that reminds me maybe more of a camera like the EOS SL2 or 200D. The EOS R50 is a very compact APS-C mirrorless camera with a 24 megapixel sensor and a very competent autofocus system, definitely better than anything we ever saw on the M mount. And it's all for a price currently of $580 US for the body only, or $700 with this 18 to 45 millimeter image stabilized lens. Now, there are some pros and cons with this compact camera, but in many ways, it's kind of hard to give it a final score until we see whether or not Canon is actually going to support the RFS mount in a way that they didn't with the EF-M mount. We are close to 2 years in at the time I'm doing this review with the EOS R7, the first APS-C R-mount mirrorless body. It's been released for nearly 2 years, and to this point we have a grand total of 4 lenses available. All of them slow, very variable aperture zooms. There's not really a lens in the lineup that gets me excited. So obviously that is going to have to be settled out to see whether Canon is going to support this system. But setting that aside for now, we'll explore the now of the EOS R50 right after a word from our sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by the Fantom Duffel, a new unique convertible duffel bag that starts as a compact packable case that easily fits into your luggage or carry-on bag, but then converts into a 35-liter duffel. The exterior is made of 1680D ballistic nylon, which is tough and weatherproof. The interior has a high-visibility reflective finish that allows you to easily see what's inside, even in a dim hotel room. A large foam pouch on the side has a cable pass-through to allow for charging, and the removable straps use a fidlock system to easily and securely connect them. I've been using it for the gym, and it has room for my water bottle, a change of clothes, a basketball, my massive shoes, a towel, and a charger for my cell phone. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check it out and use code DUSTIN20 for 20% off when you're ready to check out. So let's start by talking about the build and handling, the ergonomics here. I'll start by saying that little cameras like this are a tough fit for my hands. I feel like I end up kind of pinching the camera rather than actually gripping it, because there just isn't enough room for me to really curl my fingers to where the grip is fitting tightly against them. So I just kind of have to pinch down and support it. And so in many ways, it's harder for me to hold a small camera like this than it is a larger one. And so I wanted to go for a second opinion on the ergonomics, because it's clearly not designed for someone with my size hands. So I had my wife use it a bit. She has much smaller hands. She liked it just fine, and she would say that it would be a pro rather than a con for her. So if you're looking for a very compact camera, or if you have small hands, the R50 will be a better fit for you than what it was for me. Now, it certainly is lightweight. It weighs in at just 13.2 ounces or 375 grams, and that is with the battery and the memory card installed. Now, interestingly, at one point, Canon was going a little bit more upscale, a little more Fuji-ish with their control scheme. That was going back to the EOS M5, and it had a total of 4 different control wheels or dials on it. In this case, we have gone to literally a single wheel at this point, although you can get a secondary control with the control ring on if you're using Canon RF mount lenses. Those typically will have that control ring, so that might give you a secondary point, but obviously if you're adapting older lenses like EF mount lenses, you're not going to have that available to you. And so you're basically relying for navigation on the very large touchscreen that is on the back. We don't even really have a fully kind of developed D-pad here, in that everything is already assigned some function. So you can use that some for navigation once you get into the menu. You can use the D-pad, but typically the D-pad is going to have assigned values that you would have to reprogram. So there's definitely no joystick or anything like that. You're going to mostly navigate with the touchscreen. Fortunately, Canon's touchscreens are fantastic. They are highly responsive. The menu gives you enough space to actually touch and navigate on there. And so I do appreciate that, and it certainly makes up for a lot of the other ergonomic vulnerabilities when you have such a good touchscreen there. This is, for the size of the camera, it's a very large touchscreen. It is 3 inches. It has a very decent 1.62 million dot resolution. In many ways, I feel like this camera in general is designed more for people who don't want to do particularly all the old DSLR stuff, or don't want a lot of controls. They really want to use it more like a point and shoot. And you can see even in the menu system itself that it typically, before you dive into a deeper mode, when you switch into a mode, the first menu that's going to pop up is going to be more of a basic menu that kind of tells you, what the function or that mode, how it operates. And so I would say that this camera is designed a lot for people who want the better image quality than what, say, their old point and shoot or their camera phone is going to be able to produce. But at the same time, they don't want to be overwhelmed by a lot of physical controls. Now, if you're familiar with these type cameras from Canon, you're going to find a pretty familiar button layout here. The buttons are fairly flush, so not easy to use if you're wearing gloves, but obviously it's a compact camera and they've got to fit a lot in there. I will note that because of this small size of the grip over here, my palm is going to be all the way over onto the LCD screen, covering up all the buttons. So, that's part of the reason why they are so flush, is so you don't actually depress them with your palm when you're gripping there. Now, obviously, there is no separate mode dial for video mode, and so video is just on the top mode dial, and it is laid out, no custom modes. This is a more basic style camera with just kind of the basics there on top. One thing I will point out is that's unusual in my experience with Canon cameras is that there is no self-cleaning function at all on the sensor itself, and so you're not going to get the vibration, so you might want to get a blower just to help to keep that sensor clean. The EVF here it's nothing impressive, but it's decent specs for this class of camera. It's a 2.36 dot million dot EVF here. I will say that I certainly prefer this position than what we get with a lot of these small Sony APS-C bodies where the viewfinder is off to the left side. So I do prefer the central location. Again, more typical to what I see on Canon cameras, but also on Fuji cameras as well. There is a small flash here, though I recommend that you only use it out of absolute necessity. I can't even find a guide rating for it. It's not super bright. And unless you really like the look of direct flash photography, I would recommend that you find other ways to get better shots out of it. There is a single card slot, and in this case it's only UHS 1 rated, and that becomes relevant in just a moment. Also down here is going to be the battery. It is the LP-E17 battery, same battery that it's actually used on the larger EOS R8 budget full-frame mirrorless camera. I dinged it a little bit there because it just seems like a cheap out kind of move by Canon in that body. In this body here, though, it makes a lot more sense. It is large enough. It's rated for 440 shots when using the LCD screen, 310 when using the viewfinder, though it's not hard to exceed either one of those. And battery life didn't seem unusually poor at all in my test and in my use. You're probably going to want to get a secondary battery. It's smart to have one, and particularly if you're wanting to shoot something like 4K video, that does eat through battery life fairly quickly. Now, this camera does have some of Canon's improved communication standards, including the ability to use it as a webcam or for video conference calls without any additional software. That's always going to be welcome. There is no in-body image stabilization, though at this price point, I didn't really expect it. The various ports are divided up to the two sides of the camera, with on the left side it being only the microphone input. On the right side, we have the USB-C and HDMI ports. That is a micro HDMI output there. So you are missing things like headphone monitoring jack. Nothing like that is present here. Now the body here does remind me a little bit more something like the SL2, not really like the early EOS M bodies, which tend to be all magnesium. They were actually really nicely made cameras. This feels a little bit more plastically by comparison. And I would be remiss if I did not point out at this point that, as a general system observation, Canon RF mount remains closed to third-party lenses. And so in this sense, it is a bit of a step back from where we were with the EOS M system. While there wasn't a lot of Canon lenses for EOS M, at least it was open, and so that there was some Sigma lenses, some Samyang lenses, some Tamron lenses, Viltrox lenses available. You could get some lenses on that platform, whereas on RF mount they simply aren't available at this point. So that's obviously very unfortunate. It means that you're limited to whatever Canon puts out, and right now there are no prime lenses for EFS, so you're stuck using some of the full frame, the cheaper, smaller, full frame prime lenses for RF from Canon. Obviously not crazy about that aspect of Canon's current direction. The kit lens is an 18 to 45 millimeter f4.5 to 6.3 IS STM lens. It runs you about $120 in addition if you're wanting to buy that in kit. It's not a fantastic lens, but neither is it a bad lens either. I will release a review of the lens itself down the road if you're interested in that. Now the shutter here, I recently did the EOS R8, and it's kind of the same shutter configuration. So that seems to be a direction that Canon maybe is moving with their less expensive cameras, in that we don't really have a fully mechanical shutter. We have the option of an electronic first cut curtain mechanical shutter here. That can get you up to 12 frames per second in burst mode, not bad at all. And it also has an upper shutter speed limit of 1/4000th of a second, which is not fantastic, but it's pretty typical for this class. And a little bit better than usual is your flash sync speed is 1/250th of a second, which again is not bad at all. Now the other option is to go to a fully electronic shutter. You can choose for it to make a little bit of a clicking sound or no sound at all. You can get a little bit faster burst, up to 15 frames per second, and you have a little bit higher of a shutter speed limit, up to 1/8000th of a second, but you aren't going to be able to do any kind of flash syncing, for example, no flash photography with it. And so, there's some obviously pros and cons, some rolling shutter, things like that to be aware of that can be a factor with a purely electronic shutter. In either system, obviously 12 frames per second and 15 frames per second is not radically different. Both figures are very, very good for a camera like this, but at the same time, it's kind of offset by the fact that the buffer depth is extremely small. Remember I mentioned that it's only UHS 1 compatible, the memory card slot here. That means that it's not writing very quickly to the card, and that shows up. And so if you are going to shoot RAWs, full RAWs, your buffer limit is 7. So at 12 frames per second or 15 frames per second, that means you're getting well less than a second of burst or buffer depth before you run out of that. And even if you switch to C-RAW, that's compressed RAWs, you're only going to get 15 compressed RAWs. So, if you're shooting with the electronic shutter, that's 1 second. It's a little bit more if you're shooting with the electronic first curtain shutter. Your JPEG depth is a maximum of 42. So again, it's still not all that great. And so I found that to be very restrictive when I tried to shoot burst. And it's a shame because otherwise autofocus is fairly good here. We have dual pixel AF here, which is a great focus system, not as good as the current absolute best from Canon, but it's a very good focus system with nearly 100%, basically 100% coverage of the entire frame, divided into 651 autofocus zones. I found that whole area AF works very good, and it felt kind of weird to me. Here I am pinching this little camera like for events, trying to hang on to it, but able to just track around with a speaker up front and just seeing it lock onto the eye and track around was was really kind of an interesting juxtaposition of the two extremes, at least for me personally. I did use it for some portraits, and I found that I got very good portrait results. No issues there with autofocus, nice and sticky on the eye, well focused in results. I found that I got good autofocus results even with the kit lens. And you can see here my basic test that, autofocus is doing a good job of transitioning from one to the other. You can see outdoors that sped up a little bit even with the kit lens. And then you can also see that eye stickiness is really quite good. As I moved around, it does a good job of locking on and staying on the eye. Now, when I went to do some bursts and tracking, I found that the tracking is good, but not as robust as what I saw on the EOS R8. It was pretty much magical and staying sticky on there. I used the exact same lens, which is the RF 24-105 f4LIS for both of those tests, and I definitely got better results with the R8 than I did with the R50. I did see a bit of back focus swing sometimes with this, whereas I didn't see that at all with the EOS R8. I love a couple of things here. I love the whole area AF, that it works so well. I love even more the fact that Canon has an auto subject detection for the AI tracking. So rather than having to choose the right subject, you can just let the camera does it, and it does a great job of that. And so you're kind of always ready for whatever you want to track, whether it's a human, animal, vehicle subject. You can switch between those things without any kind of issue. I did find that autofocus in low light was also remained good, and video AF was good as well. It's using essentially the same autofocus system with just a fewer tracking zones, but it does a very good job there as well. I would say this is probably the biggest area of growth for Canon's compact cameras, is the improvement in autofocus that we see. Now, on the video side of things, you have a upper limit of 4K 30, but it's very good 4K 30. It's got 6K oversampling, full sensor readout. That's one of the very nice things about shooting with this 6,000 by 4,000 pixel resolution, is that it translates really well to oversampling from 6K. You can shoot, you have the option of shooting, kind of normal, and then also in shooting HDR PQ. There is no log mode here, and so if you're wanting a little bit more dynamic range, you're going to need to shoot in HDR PQ, which is fine. It just takes a little bit more storage and will eat your battery up just a little bit faster. If you want to do slow motion in full HD, you can shoot up to 120 frames per second, and so you can do some slow motion work there. There is no self-imposed recording limit. You're basically going to be able to record according to Canon's white pages. It seems like your overall recording time is going to be limited by one of two things: the size of your card and the capacity of your battery. When the battery dies, obviously the recording quits. The biggest thing that annoyed me about video mode here is that you have basically two control options when it comes to your video mode. There's either a full auto mode, and so you don't have control over aperture, or you have the option of going to a fully manual mode. Obviously, I want to be able to retain aperture control. And so I did the manual mode most of the time. I would prefer obviously having an AV mode there to give me the kind of control I want. But unfortunately, I found that the metering in video mode wasn't perfect, and I ended up with a lot of underexposed footage when I was shooting in manual, even though the actual metering showed that I was shooting at basically zero EV, not under or overexposed at all. And so that was one irritant. And so when things are right in the settings, the footage looks very good, but I did end up with a fair bit of underexposed. That seems to be the way that it biases as far as the metering. And so not as fantastic as what I saw with the EOS R8, but again, it has about all you would expect for this level of camera in terms of the video specs. So finally, let's talk about the sensor. And on the sensor side of things, I will give you a really quick overview. I'll give you my conclusion, and then we'll do a full sensor deep dive if you're interested in that at the end of the review. So this is a new 24 megapixel sensor. It is shared with the R10. So it first debuted in the R10. It is now adopted in use here. And so it is a little bit improved from Canon's previous 24 megapixel APS-C sensors. It shows a little bit better dynamic range. Photons of photos rates it at 10.57 stops, which is as good as what we've ever seen from a Canon APS-C sensor. So some improvements on that front. Color and detail all look good. I was slightly disappointed with the ISO results. I felt like I saw more noise and a little bit more color blotchiness earlier than what I anticipated. And so I did go to Photons Photos to check their results, and I found that yes, in fact, there's considerably better results that are coming from some other brands' APS-C sensors. And so you're going to see a little bit better results from either Sony or Fuji in that regard, Nikon. And so it's a little bit of a regression maybe on the ISO front, but overall, this is a camera that you're able to get great looking images with good detail. Looks fine. I'm more of a full frame man myself. I do prefer the larger sensors personally, but I also recognize in comparing to other APS-C sensors that Canon is moving along in the right direction, and this sensor is definitely improved in some areas, just not all of them. So in conclusion, I feel like there's a little bit of a one step forward, two steps back here. There are areas that are definitely improved autofocus, good autofocus system for such a compact camera. It's a slightly improved sensor, but I don't like the control ergonomics as well as what I've seen from some previous compact models like the M5 from Canon in the past. The other kind of major issue here is because this remains a closed platform to third-party development, it means that those of you that started to invest in the EOS M system, and maybe you have some EF-M lenses, they aren't going to be able to adapt to this. So, they're kind of gone in that way. And any of the third-party, M-mount lenses won't work here. So you're stuck with whatever's available on RF. And to this point, Canon hasn't done a ton of lens releases. I hope that's going to change in the near future. But that does remain a very real consideration, at least at this point. And at some point, the excuse, well, you can adapt a whole catalog of EF lenses. At some point, that has got to cease to be the justification here, because that's what I've been hearing ever since the EOS R was released, 5 years ago. So this is a solid little camera if you want to travel light, particularly if you have smaller hands. It's a very decent camera for the money if you're on a budget. It is a little bit hard for me to recommend it over similar Sony or Fuji models, however, because of the lack of lenses available for it. Now, if you're a Canon person and you believe in Canon's roadmap moving ahead, by all means, go ahead and invest in this system. But I do know that from feedback from the audience, there's a number of you that are getting frustrated with Canon's philosophy at this point. Here's hoping that that's going to change in the near future. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you want more information, you can check out my full text review that's linked in the description down below. And if you want a deeper dive into the sensor performance, stay tuned. Let's jump into it together. So we'll start by taking a look at resolution and color. Now at 24 megapixel, this is not Canon's highest resolution sensor. That is the 32.5 megapixel sensor found in the EOS R7 and other models. But here we can see that 24 megapixels is enough that even at a pixel level to produce nice detail in the image. Colors here look fine. Obviously, Canon has a lot of experience in being able to produce nice looking images. So while this isn't a top resolution point, frankly, it is, I think it's plenty on an APS-C sensor, and obviously going higher than that does come with some issues that we'll detail a little bit more later. So clearly this camera is capable of capturing beautiful colors. One of the many, many lakes here in Ontario, you can see the ice starting to melt off. And near sunset, you can see that the detail is really nice. As we'll get to in a moment, shadows don't always recover as clean as what I would like. And this is one area where APS-C often bows to a full frame or larger sensor. But you can see across the frame, capable of getting nice color and a lot of detail there. Now, I did find, as I kind of started to allude to in the last image, that when you start to kind of push this camera, I find that it's, you get a little bit more noise than what I would like. I also found that it's maybe not as flexible in editing color as what I would say I find to be with their full frame sensors from Canon. And so I just found that colors kind of pushed a little bit more than what I would like when starting to do editing. But again, here looking at detail, you can see throughout the frame, we have nice detail here. And this particular shot is taken with the 18 to 45 millimeter kit lens. Now, when it comes to skin tones, this particular shot is taken with the Samyang RF 85mm f1.4. So it does tend towards a little bit yellowy, as you can see here. So popping over to a native Canon lens, this is the RF 28mm f2.8. You can see that skin tones look nice and natural. Again, something that Canon is renowned for doing well. And you can see that the skin tones, they don't go green. They're not overly magenta. They're nice and neutral here. Another portrait shot here, you can see again, it's capable of producing really nice detail for portrait work, good skin tones, and the overall color here looks nice. So next we'll take a look at dynamic range. And first of all, here is a properly exposed kind of our base setting here for dynamic range. So a few areas that we'll look at in the textures along here and inside the mirror, inside the SLR. What we want to see in this is we want to retain good contrast. We don't want to see color blotchiness. In here, we don't want to see noise get out of control. In the color swatches, obviously, we don't want to see any kind of color shift, but colors to stay neutral as we recover. And then also here in the shadow information, again, we want to see shadows not get kind of messed up with a lot of extra noise or color shifts, blotchiness, things like that. So we'll see how we do here in recovering shadows. Now, modern cameras are typically very, very good when it comes to recovering any kind of smaller amount of shadow information. So I'm going to jump right to 3 stops. We'll look at 3, 4, and 5 stops. So you can see here with the original that shadows are obviously very crushed here. You can also see that there is some odd coloration due to that underexposure taking place in the timer face and some of the swatches. But we can see here on the right side where I've added those 3 stops of exposure back to the image in post that everything here looks nice and clean. Looking at this, I don't really see any kind of color blotchiness. Looking inside the mirror area, I don't see any obvious noise. This area right here is going to be one where we'll see most likely noise start to happen. It looks fine here, and I'm not seeing a lot of hot pixels, though I can see it is not perfectly uniform in the recovered area there. Looking at the color swatches, we can see just a little bit of fine noise there, but nothing severe, no kind of grid pattern in this area, anything like that yet. Here at 4 stops, looking at it globally, obviously on the left side, the original, everything is crushed even more. But we can see it looks about the same in the recovered point looking at it globally. And if we jump into a pixel level, we can see that, again, the timer face has recovered nicely. We can see looking at these swatches, there's a bit more noise, but I don't really see any kind of grid pattern there. Looking here at the grip on the SLR, no color blotchiness. A little bit more noise visible inside on the mirror, but not terrible. Likewise, down here, you can see there's a little bit more noise. And you can see that we're getting a little more unevenness in the shadows. I think I can see a little bit of color blotchiness there. And also, it's not evenly black anymore. We're definitely producing some noise as we recover the shadows there at 4 stops. Now at 5 stops, everything was obviously very deeply crushed. In recovering it, we can see in the timer face that, yes, the color is restored right, but you can see some really obvious noise in there as well. You can also see that here. You can also see if, hopefully it'll show up on screen. There's a little bit of green and magenta color blotchiness there. Definitely a more visible noise there. You can also see a little bit of that blotchiness now in what should be uniformly black here in the grip. Some very obvious noise inside here. And as we come down here, you can just see that the noise pattern has gotten a whole lot rougher. Likewise, in the area that should be kind of just shadowed, you can see it more over here that it's very, very uneven. So definitely, I would say while you're still able to recover beyond 3 stops, you're going to do that at some increased cost when it comes to noise and also some color blotchiness. So now we'll go the other direction. We're going to take a look at the ability to recover highlights. So we're going to start at 2 stops, typically 1 stop. Every camera can do that, no problem. So the main thing we're looking for here, as you can see in the timer face, some of the color information has been lost on the overexposure. Over here, there's going to be hot spots and texture that goes away on the cover of the Pentax here, and then also down on this lever. You can see that some of the color swatches, colors will start to disappear. So we're going to see how we do in recovering all of that. So shifting over to the right side here, starting with the timer face, you can see everything is nice and uniform there. That color has been recovered fine. Also on the front of the SLR here, we can see that the kind of the metal texture has been recovered. Likewise here on this lever on the front of it, there's no leftover hot spots, so pretty good there. And in our swatches up here, we can see that colors that started to disappear have come back pretty uniformly without any kind of major issue there. Finally, down here in the spine of this book, you can see that it was blown out initially, but it is recovered back to where contrast looks natural and normal. So while we were completely successful with the 2-stop recovery, we can see at 3 stops that things are not quite as rosy. Somewhere between 2 and 3 stops, we reach a limit of perfect recovery. So we can see in the timer face now, there is just unevenness in terms of the coloration. So there, where it's shadowed a bit towards the edge, you can see the proper colors there, but it's blown out a little bit more in the center. Likewise, looking at the cover of the SLR, you can see that some of that metal grain texture is gone from this point. Less exposed here, and so that has recovered pretty much fine. Looking up at the color swatches, color information has come back. That's something that Canon's more recent sensors have done quite well. You can see here that all of those color swatches have been recovered. Looking down here, we can see that the contrast, it's a little bit give and take. It's not perfect, but it's come back reasonably well. And so we're starting to lose some things there at 3 stops, but you might be able to live with that. Now, when it comes to 4 stops of recovery, we can see that the end result is completely unnatural. A lot of color information has been lost and not recovered in some of these swatches here. The colors here, even many of them that have not been blown out, they just look very washed out and dingy. And so this is obviously not a successful recovery. So obviously the ability to recover dynamic range just gives you some editing choices. So for example, in this shot, I shot framing and obviously exposing for the lighthouse beyond. That means that a lot of the information here of this structure is crushed away. So if we look in here, we can see we've been able to recover this information that shows us the plate that was there holding that beam up. Likewise, looking up in here, we've been able to recover that information in the shadows here quite effectively to where we can see everything that's there. And sure, there's a little bit of extra noise has been introduced, but it's obviously acceptable. Likewise, in this shot here, I obviously exposed for the sunrise in the shot, and we can see looking down here that all the blacks were crushed here. Looking to the right side, we can see that we've been able to successfully recover that information there in the rocks. If we jump in and look at a pixel level, we can see that there is some noise that comes at the cost of that. You can see that there's just grain here and there, perhaps a little bit of some color blotchiness there in some of the darker areas that were more crushed. But, you know, we're able to, if you look at the image as a whole, it's fine. If you did some noise reduction, again, it would be fine. So it's definitely useful, though it's not perfect. It's not as good as what I'm typically seeing on their Canon's full frame sensors. So now we're going to take a look at how this camera handles high ISO performance. Now, one quick caveat is that while 24 megapixels doesn't sound very high, realize that full frame equivalent for a Canon 24 megapixels because of its 1.6 times crop factor. So that is actually more pixel density than, say, the EOS R5 and its 45 megapixels of resolution. So again, on the left side, we have what is going to be our base ISO, and we're going to compare it as we move on up. We're going to start at ISO 800 here. So a few things that we'll look for. Once again, we're going to be looking at the grip texture here. We want to see it stay with good contrast. Again, no color shifts. The various noise spots that we've looked at before, we'll look at that. We'll look at the color swatches, and we'll also look at the shadow area to see if those pixels remain even there, and so that our contrast remains good. So we can see, having already looked around this image a bit, that at ISO 800 things are really still very clean. There's the just the beginning of a little bit of noise, but nothing that's obvious, nothing that is destructive to the image. At ISO 1600, looking at it at a global level, obviously things look pretty much equal, maybe just a tiny bit less contrast. If we punch in here, we can see that there's just a tiny bit of maybe some color blotchiness on that grip texture. Probably not enough that you would ever notice it. There's a little bit extra noise you can see on the surface of the mirror inside here. If we look in this kind of shadow area here, it still looks nice and clean. up into this, you can see just a little bit of fine noise. We look down into this area, not a whole lot in terms of roughness. Looking into the shadows, however, the shadows already are a little bit more uneven than what I would like. As we go on up to 3200, you can see already we're definitely starting to lose some of that shadow information, and the shadows starting to raise, which means that contrast isn't going to be as good. For example, if I throw 1600 back up here on the left, you can see compared to 3200 on the right, already it doesn't look as dark as what it did even at 1600. Going back here to the grip surface and looking inside at the mirror, it's mostly that the noise is just a little bit more obvious. You can see that the shadows aren't quite as dark. Likewise, in areas like this, you can just see a little bit more of that fine noise. We're going to continue to use ISO 1600 as kind of our last place where things were all acceptable, I would say. Moving up to 6400, you can see looking in the spine here of the color swatches, definitely more obvious noise. Likewise, in the swatches themselves, you can see that it is more obviously noisy. You can see much more noise in there on the mirror. And if we look over at the shadows are getting lighter and lighter as there's just more diversity of pixels. We're also starting to see more rough pixels in here than we did before. Now, by 12,800, you can see that's looking really rough, and so not as clean as what I would expect from either a similar Sony or Fuji sensor. I'm not necessarily blown away by the high ISO performance. You can also see the beginnings of a pattern that's going to show up here, almost a circular pattern in the shadow area. Looking at this area, the noise is really quite rough, and again, over on this side, we can see with those shadows, it's not fantastic. If we move on to 25,600, we're getting to a place that's pretty close to unusable. You can see the noise is really rough. Shadows are basically gone. And you can see these kind of circular rings that have started up. Moving back in here, you can see some color shift. You see this green blotchiness through this area. Looking also on the grip of the SLR, you can see a lot of that green shift that's taking place in those colors. Noise looks really rough here, and you can see this kind of circular pattern. So 32,000 is kind of the upper limit of the native range, and you can really see that circular pattern. In fact, if I jump out, you can see there's just like rings going around and around in there, and if we dive in close, we can really see that. Definitely more color blotches of green, a little bit of magenta here and there. I wouldn't consider that to really be a usable image. And you can go up in the expanded range to 51,200, but you can see it just gets far worse still. And so more color shift, more of that circular pattern, and then of course the amount of noise and its roughness is just really, really rough to the place where we're kind of losing shadow information almost altogether. Now here is kind of, to me, best case scenario. This is 25,600 on this camera, but I've switched to a monochrome that helps the noise to just kind of look more like film grain. But you can see that on a close examination, there's a lot of noise there, and shadow information is just not great. You have to really kind of want that particular look. I don't think that I often do, but anyway, this is an area where the 24 megapixel sensor in the EOS R8 that I just tested was much, much better. So thank you for sticking around to the very end. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.